So I'll say good evening. I'm Judy Woodward from the St. Anthony Park Branch Library Association, and our association is delighted to welcome you to this conversation with award-winning author Marcelo Hernandez Castillo about his memoir, Children of the Land. This event is part of the St. Paul Public Library's Read Brave St. Paul series, which is a collaboration between the City of St. Paul, the Friends of the St. Paul Library, St. Paul Public Schools, and the Irreducible Grace Foundation. Many of you probably have the copies of the book, of Marcelo's book, which were distributed through the generosity of Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the St. Paul Saints team. So Marcelo Hernandez Castillo is best known as an award-winning poet, and I believe this book, Children of the Land, is his first prose work. He holds a BA from Sacramento State University in California, and he was the first undocumented student to graduate from the Helen Zell Writers Program at the University of Michigan. His work has appeared or is featured in the New York Times, the Paris Review, lots of other places, and now the BBC, we understand. He lives in Marysville, California, where he teaches poetry to incarcerated youth and also teaches at the Ashland University Low Residential MFA program. So thank you all very much, and I'm going to turn the virtual podium over to Marcelo Hernandez Castillo now. Thank you.
Hello, hello. Thank you for having me. It's truly an honor to always be able to engage with readers and engage with communities that are invested in asking questions that sometimes get left behind in discussions around migration, immigration, and the life that adverse, underrepresented groups face, I guess, beyond the headlines. And today I'll be reading, I think in the spirit of Judy's talk just before I think we went live, I will be reading a section that I don't think I've ever read, but it has to do with the Midwest, and it has to do with my time in the Midwest. And for the first time, really feeling the pull of an outsider that I didn't feel before, because my entire life had been in California. And so when I was, went to grad school in the Midwest, I had never been that cold. And I guess I entered into different spaces that, academic spaces of privilege that didn't anticipate my arrival. The school didn't know what to do with me in terms of how to process my application, how to process, because it was a fully funded program, but how would they fully fund me if I didn't have a social, and so on and so forth. So it's those small things that I think for me accrue over time, and it is those small violences that build up in an individual's psyche that over the long run have much more damaging effects than the spectacular kinds of violences. And I want to acknowledge where I'm zooming into and the events that have unfolded in Minneapolis with the verdict that just came in of Derek Chauvin's verdict, and a lot of like-minded folks, a lot of people on Twitter have really been thinking about what this means and what it means that the day of the verdict, a 16-year-old girl in St. Louis was shot. And what does the verdict of Derek Chauvin do for the larger systemic issue at hand. And what a lot of big people have been saying is the verdict came because America wanted self-preservation, that America would have burned on Wednesday if any other decision would have been made. And somebody said something like, they cut off an arm to save the body. The system cut off an arm to save the body. I'm still thinking about that. I'm still thinking about what it means and what it means for the future of policing, and you know, how we can continue or not. So today, yeah, I had a lot of other like comments to talk about, but I think excuse me, forgot my water. I think I would go ahead right into the reading, and then after that we can field some questions, maybe have a conversation, and maybe talk about some of the other things that I had thought about leading up to it, inspired by Judy's questions of things like, what would I like readers to bring to this discussion? How should they read the book in order to get the most from the event? So on and so forth. All right. So this is kind of from the middle of the book. I am in Michigan, preparing to return to the border to aid my father in his immigration interview, his first one in 10 years. After being deported for 10 years, you are eligible to try again, but you've already served your 10-year sentence outside, away from your family. So basically distanced. And I guess me adjusting to a new community that I didn't really know if I belonged to, or yeah. The winter air was a cold that I still was not familiar with. One that I didn't think I would ever completely understand. Just before evening, when I didn't know if the sun was still there or not, so far behind the clouds that it was only the idea of a sun, it looked like everything was crouching down a little. The cars, the houses, the trash cans lined on the road. Just then, and only then, when everything felt closer to the earth, like it was being slowly pulled by a thin rope toward the warmth at the center, a blue descended on the backs of everything. A kind of blue I had never seen back in California, a cerulean blue that seemed older than the things it touched, as if it was not from here, but had taken a long time to arrive. And when it did, it felt eternal, though it only lasted about an hour before the boredom of the dark took over again. And when the blue was gone, I felt like I could breathe again, like I could go back outside into the night and walk upright again. When it left, it was as if someone had unplugged a TV, hissing its white noise in the background of a sad party where everyone suddenly blinks and looks around, aware for the first time that they're even at a party. You never knew it was there until it wasn't. When it left, it almost felt like it would never come back. It was hard to believe that anything like that could be done twice. And yet it did. It came back every afternoon in winter, weighing things down, making it difficult to move. I found it hard to speak when the sky looked that blue. It took more effort to open the hinges of my jaw. I had felt that way in the hot California summers too, only different. There was no blue, but a particular brightness. At the hottest time of the day, the air would stop. It was difficult to speak. People crouched a little lower too, a little further from the sun. The stray dogs outside would walk in maddening circles, their heavy tongues hanging to the side like broken arms. But in the northern Midwest, there were different reasons to wander back and forth like aimless dogs, none of which involved the sun. I like to take walks late at night. I liked to take walks late at night to get out of my head. I'm going for a walk, I said to Ruby, my wife, who was wrapped in a blanket on a small sofa we bought at the Salvation Army. We were never planning on living in the Midwest for long, so there was no point in buying anything new. I felt like nothing in the house belonged to me, like I was just borrowing it from someone whom I would never meet. It felt natural to me to move and not be tied to any of my furniture. Never in my life had I bought a brand new couch, not necessarily because I couldn't afford it, because there were times when I could, but because I had the feeling that our residence was always temporary. I hated to admit it. I hated to admit that it was easier to throw away a couch and buy another used one at a thrift store than try to ship or move it across the country. I put on my heavy jacket, my hat, my gloves, my snow boots. I liked having to put all of it on. It made even going outside for a moment feel like an event, like something special I needed to prepare myself for. It took a long time to put everything on, to lace my boots all the way up, and I appreciated that I needed to slow down just to be able to stand outside. It was never like that back at home. The outside felt like the inside, especially after the ice raid. There was not much to keep the two apart. One just turned into the other. It didn't feel special to go outside. You changed nothing about you. So once you were there, you hardly noticed that you were outside. I stood there at the front door, fully clothed, but didn't leave. It felt hot underneath all the feather down and fleece. Did you forget something? Ruby asked. No, I said quietly after a moment and opened the door to step outside. Now I'm going to segue into what I mentioned in there, the ice raid that happened in my house in 2006 while I was in high school. Ice raided the house looking for my father, who was already deported, so that it was in vain. It's titled Movement as a Trick Cereal Commercial. There were moments when I didn't need to tell my body how to move. Moments completely new to me, and yet something inside me knew exactly what to do when they came. As if I had been practicing for the Olympics. Some deep-seated knowledge rose from the very core of me. But it wasn't instinct. It was memory. I was tapping into an inheritance that, up until that moment, I didn't know I had. In this way, life appeared monotonous. Nothing was a surprise. But my body never really stopped shaking, a small breakwater holding back the tidal wave of the past. The first time I saw a gun, it was the gun that did all the talking, and part of me didn't know who to listen to, or if I was listening at all or running. It was a Sunday afternoon when I heard a knock on the door. The TV was on, and the low sun had that familiar warmth particular to Sundays, blinding half of the screen through a crack in the curtains. My little brothers and I looked so still in our reflections. No one was really watching. Ama, my mother, was in her room resting her feet, preparing to tire them again the next day. And again, the knock, louder. I opened the door and a man held it open, the words ICE stitched onto his vest in bright gold letters. We're looking for Marcelo Hernandez, he said. And before I could say anything, he walked in past me, followed by three others. It happened so fast that I doubted it was actually happening. They all had their hands on their guns at the ready because you never know, right? The gun looked larger than I imagined one would look like in my head. It was 2006 in the same Northern California home my family had rented for 8 years and would go on to rent for another decade. I was only a senior in high school. Maybe it was high time I should have seen a gun by then. I was overdue. I knew ICE was all around us, that a raid was just on the horizon, but I couldn't tell anyone what I was watching out for, what I was always anticipating. I could hear Ama's words rattle in my head. Never tell anyone. She didn't need to remind me. I always knew. I saw them everywhere. I saw agents in trees. I saw their heads popping out of the ground like tulips. I felt their hands touching every coin in my pocket. But my mistake was that I always saw them outside. Never did I think I would one day find them inside my house. For some reason, I thought our house existed beyond the limits of the border, as if it was a sovereign country of its own. It was the only place I didn't have to scrutinize myself. The only place the shaking stopped a little. Green was still my favorite color. Their green fatigues had the afterthought of something living. Green and spring, the green leaves of frangipani, iris, lily of the valley, overshadowed by so much color. I judged the ability of my body by its speed and weight. I judged how long it would take me to reach the back door and who would do the talking. They had the house surrounded. Is Marcelo Hernandez home? He barked again. I'm Marcelo Hernandez, I said. He looked at his paper in his hand as if it was the first time he was seeing it, as if he needed to go outside and check the address to make sure they had the right place. This happened sometimes. They would get the wrong address, but would pick up whoever was at the house they happened to storm anyways. It was better coming back to the office than coming back to the office empty-handed. It was a numbers thing, you understand? I'm looking for your father, he said, scanning the room. Who else is home? My little brother sat on the couch, staring at the swirls on the carpet. They were getting their first lesson in speaking only when spoken to, in answering only what was necessary. I did all the talking. In my head, I wondered if in 10 or 20 years, that would be my face printed on the warrant in their hands. If I was capable of taking more than just my father's name and blood. It had been about 3 years since Appa was deported in 2003. There was already nothing left of him in the house except for some old tools in the garage and the dip on his side of the bed, the outline of his absence weathered beneath the weight of his stillness over the years. Beyond that, all that remained was the likeness of my gestures to his, the way I carried my body, the way my mother said I chewed my food, even his spare toothbrush that had been thrown away long ago. It wasn't on purpose. There wasn't any thought to it. One day it was there, and another it wasn't. We didn't bother going through the stages of loss. We were young, but could already turn off the parts of ourselves that hurt like a light switch. In 10 years, I would hardly remember any of it. Surely Ama heard the noises from her room, but I knew she was still there. I knew she would never leave. My mother is in her room, but she has a heart condition, and I'm afraid you might scare her. Can I please go back and tell her you are here and bring her out? Okay, said the agent, and nodded to the others. I went into the dark back room, waded through the thick smell of analgesic cream Ama rubbed on her joints at night. Ama asked who was in the living room. I told her not to worry. I said everything would be okay. I said it like that, okay, and grabbed her by the arm. Someone wants to talk with you. It will be okay, okay? They're looking for Appa. Everything will be okay. I never said the word ice. She knew who I was talking about. I walked her out of the room and didn't let go of her arm as we entered the living room. I knew we both had that deep knowledge of flight inside of us, although neither of us had ever spoken of it to each other. This wasn't the fight or flight instinct we all have. It was particular to immigrants because although everything inside us told us to run, we didn't. I knew her muscles were tensing just like mine, even if she wasn't able to run in her old age like I was. And yet, holding her, I wasn't sure if I was keeping her from falling or keeping her from running away. I could feel her body digging up memories of past raids. What if my body ran away involuntarily? What if it left Ama behind out of instinct or some generational memory? I wasn't sure what I was or wasn't capable of doing. How long has he been gone? The agent asked. The agent asked my mother, and I answered because he asked in English, which she did not know. I did this often to avoid the brief and awkward silence that followed when such questions were thrown at her. I had always been a good translator. All of our doctor's visits, all of our doctor's visits, oops, I lost my place. All of our doctor's visits translated for my mother had trained me for this. I took out my phone and showed him my contacts and pointed to the bright little screen. It said Apa with a number from Mexico. I didn't have a calling card to dial out of the country, and I knew it would be expensive to call him without one, but called anyways. I called as my only proof that he was indeed in Mexico and not with us, but he didn't answer. I thought back to the times I wished he didn't answer, only to hear the familiar click of his phone coming on. I called again, hoping this time Apa would answer, to tell them how far away he was, to describe everything around him as if he were on vacation, talking to his friends back home about how pretty it was. Again, no answer. How else could I tell them that there was nothing here for them? Not me, not my brothers, not my mother, and certainly not my father. Sometimes I stuttered when talking to adults, but in such situations, I was calm as if the panic part of me had run. The other agents came back after looking for evidence of him and finding none. Our house looked like he had never been there. The agent took my phone and wrote the number down that I called. "We'll be in touch," he said, turned around and left as quickly as he came. They all shuffled out the door. It was quiet again, but our ears were ringing. Nothing was safe. We sat in our living room and held each other and sobbed quietly. For a moment, immediately after their departure, even holding each other felt like pinpricks. Ama had lost us once before to the immigration system, and she held us tight because she thought she was going to lose us again. We were separated as children, and even though I was much younger that first time, even though I was beyond despair, I feared deportation more than I feared ending my life. If I failed or succeeded, the rest of the family would be investigated and split either way. I had long ago embraced futility before I knew there was even a word for it. Even though we weren't taken on that quiet Sunday afternoon, we knew we easily could have been, and that possibility corroded us from the inside. I forgot what my mother looked like before the perpetual panic draped itself over her face. I couldn't imagine her any more beautiful. But since it was only my first and my mother's fourth, fifth, eighth grade, perhaps she always looked the same, and it was just my vision that had gotten clearer. From that moment forward, I never stood still. My nervousness spiked unimaginably high. We never opened our door or windows again. What was once sweet now had the bitter aftertaste of uncured olives. It didn't matter how good I was at hiding. I knew they would always find me if they wanted. It was useless to blend in, to not bring attention to myself. It didn't matter if I perfected my English. It was useless to try to negotiate two worlds at once when only one of them was visible while the other one threatened to collapse. And yet I tried, but it came at a price. So much of my energy was spent trying to avoid getting caught. I wonder how much more I could have done with my life if I had been spared the energy it took to survive. The next day I went to school. Mama went to work. I ate quietly with my mouth shut in the cafeteria. I had to tell myself when to swallow. Things no longer happened by themselves. I had to tell my body how to do them. Even laughter required some kind of effort. I had to remind myself, this is funny. This is how you laugh. Laugh now. Laugh hard. Spit out your food. Thank you, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Because we are a nice, manageable size group, I'm going to just ask people, if you have something to say, if you'd like to ask a question, please just unmute yourself and let's do it. I think this is much the most comfortable way to run things. I guess I can go first unless somebody else wants to. Have you heard enough from me?
No.
Okay.
Not at all.
All right. Well, the first thing I'm going to ask is it's almost a plot point. What had happened to your father? And did your father ever reunite with your mother? Was your father indeed kidnapped at the end of the book? And has he ever been able to return to the United States, or did your mother go back to Mexico? What happened to resolve that situation?
So, right after the section that I read about the Midwest, I was preparing to go see my father at the border because it had been 10 years since he'd been deported. The scene that I mentioned in right now that I just finished reading, at that point he had been deported for 3 years. And so when his 10 years were up, by that time I had DACA. By that time I had established my permanent residency. So I was able to cross the border and assist him with his immigration interview, with his biometrics that you have to present when you do your interview. And we thought it was a done deal. We thought, you did your time, now reap the rewards. We followed the rules for the first time. We did what they asked, so we believed it was just a formality. What we didn't know is that it wasn't a formality, that all that waiting was in vain, because all that waiting was just waiting for them to tell us no. And so he was denied. And so I crossed the border back into El Paso without my father. Had he been accepted, that very same day he would have crossed over. So I crossed over by myself with my wife. And my father left back to his home about 3 states over on the bus. And that is when my mother decided to return back to Mexico. That's when she said all of her children were grown. They had already all made their lives. She decided enough was enough. She had finished waiting. And so she returned back to Mexico. And she was only there for 2 months before this event happened. And we got a call saying that he had been kidnapped by a cartel. And we spoke with the members of the cartel, and my mother hid in the house when they picked up my dad, and took her to the border, as the book says. We passed her and brought her on humanitarian parole, and she had a wrist GPS tracker on her ankle. And once we were able to secure my father's release, we flew him to the border again, did everything all over again that we did with my mother. and were successful after him being in detention for about a month or so. He was able to be released into the custody, into the care of his family. And so he and my mother reunited in the US for the first time. And we thought, this is it. You know, this is the beginning of something new. We're given a second chance. We're going to make the best of it. And throughout the whole book, the book hinges on this question: has my father changed? Has he changed enough for us to trust him with our mother? Because she would be suddenly with him in his environment, not hers, in his home, not hers, without the protection of all of us who we had always intervened in his rage, in his abusiveness. We had always intervened, which saved my mother. But what isn't in this book ends with his return. What isn't in this book is what happened immediately after, is that even though he had been saved, even though his children lost everything they had in order to save him, I don't say a particular amount in the book of what it cost, the ransom, but it was $120,000. We lost everything in order to save him, even though he wasn't the best father, even though he didn't try to come back in those 10 years. Yes, we say he served his time, but he didn't make the effort. Me now as a father, would I make the effort to come back? Of course I would. Even if I was returned 100 times, I would still try to cross to see my family. He didn't. Nonetheless, he's our father. And so I think something that I learned that is not in the book, the question that doesn't get answered in this book is, can somebody change? Can somebody's life fundamentally change because of exterior factors? The factor being separated for 10 years. Did 10 years soften him? Did 10 years of solitude do anything to his psyche so that he would want to live a different kind of life? Did being kidnapped, threatened every day with decapitation change him? And I thought it did. But I was wrong. You know, a couple years into them living together again, my mother had to leave because she feared for her life. And so they're separated again. She lives with me, and we have an apartment for my dad that we're still paying rent on together, all of the children. Yeah. I don't see him. I haven't spoke with him in a year. You know, it was his choice. And so he's missing out on his grandson, my son, who's 3. So I don't know what it takes for somebody to change. Maybe that was just him. Maybe anybody else would have changed.
As you say, you are a father as well as a son, and I'm interested in the gift and the burden on the next generation. Unlike you, he has a secure sense of place in the United States since he was born. How do you think his life will be different from yours? And what, if there's anything, will he lose by being a native born, let's say? Is there an edge of sensibility that he will lose that you have as a result of your experiences, your very different experiences?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I just finished reading this book here, Halfway Home by Reuben Jonathan Miller. And it's about race, punishment, and the afterlife of mass incarceration. And I was thinking about his idea of the afterlife and the different people around the one person incarcerated that life of incarceration affects. And it's not just that one person who is affected by incarceration, but his children and his parents and his friends who he has, you know, just is a web that people are not able to leave behind, even once the person has been released. And so I have a passage in my book that says, we have been doing this for 100 years. What other immigrants of European descent were able to accomplish in less than one generation, it has taken us 4 generations to get half of where they got in one generation. We are still doing the same thing that my great grandfather was trying to do in 1916 when he crossed through El Paso. We are nowhere further along. In terms of securing our safety, in terms of securing our sense of our peace of mind, in terms of securing our sense of belonging. That's what he was searching, and that's what he didn't find, and that's why he returned. And that's what his children and his children's children, and finally my generation, we're still trying to do, find a place to belong. That's the shakiness that I talk about in the opening. And so I'm wondering, will it stop with my son's generation? It didn't stop with my brother's children's generation, which is my son's generation, they're cousins. Mm-hmm. It didn't stop, they're older than he is. It didn't stop with them, because when everything was happening with my father, they were affected by it. Their grandfather was kidnapped by a cartel. And how do you explain that to a 15-year-old? They were 13 and 16, I believe. You know, the traumas that we thought we could evade in that next generation, in my brother's children's generation, didn't happen. And so even until for the rest of their lives, or for the rest of my parents' lives, that predicament that they are in, that they're still fighting for validity, for documentation, hasn't gone away. And so the web of who that affects is wide sweeping. Mm-hmm. Even if I have a cousin who still is working on his papers, he could reach out to me at any time, and I would be compelled to be there to talk to him about these immigration lawyers that we've seen and talk to him about the experiences. And so you're never out of that mindset. And he talked in this book, he talks about, like, he's teaching at the University of Michigan, and he's at this meeting with all these other faculty, and, you know, it's again these like very elite spaces and whatnot. And he gets a call from his brother in prison, and suddenly he's like swept away from that room and taken to just all of these memories and feelings that he has, and suddenly he is feels like he's another person. He feels distance from his faculty, his colleagues, who aren't having to have these conversations. And so for my son, will he have to have these conversations? Will I have to become a citizen in order for him to finally arrive? When do we finally arrive? When are we finally here? I don't know if that's going to happen with my son's generation. I don't know if that's going to happen with his children's generation, you know, who are going to be facing the brunt of the consequences of ecological, environmental refugees, in which in the next 10, 20 years, our food sources will deplete, and we will have a situation like we've never had it before, where we have environmental refugees. And it's happening now because of, you know, other things that in climate change that feel very distant from immigration, but are very closely tied to it. There's this book that I highly recommend by Todd Miller. It's called Storming the Wall: Climate Change, Migration, and Homeland Security, in which he talks about how climate change is affecting migration, and how the US is preparing itself for that scenario. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I guess I addressed it with, I hope that in my son's generation, we can move beyond the things that we've been facing, but I don't hold out too much hope.
I'd like to give the floor to someone else. I know a couple of you had prepared questions. Who would like to ask a question? Please unmute yourself and go ahead. Gonna make me do all the talking? Rita, how about you?
Rita.
All right. Oh, and then Lydia.
Well, I was just looking, at the situation at the border now, the large influx, particularly of children. Also, as you say, with the climate, it seems like a lot of these people are coming from Honduras or Guatemala, where the huge hurricanes came through, and they really are climate refugees. So I just wondering what your take is on that situation.
I mean, what's the difference between a cage and an overflow shelter? Is it just semantics? The difference between what the Trump administration did and what the Biden administration is doing? I don't know how else to address that question other than state the obvious, that ICE is an arm of enforcement that has become rogue, and so we don't even see the tip of the iceberg of the true crisis that humanitarian crisis that happens before they get not only to the U.S. border, but before they even get to the Mexican border, before they even get to the Guatemalan border, and the ways that policing and the nation state parallels in their violence in Mexico, based on also the same ideas of white supremacy that happen here. You have the military enforcing and inflicting violence in the southern border of Mexico, in the state of Chiapas, much the same way that the US is doing. And so you kind of have to think to yourself, if the possibility of being separated from your child, not just for some time, but forever, some children have never been reunited. Some 500 children have never been reunited, and probably never will. Those children were babies, and a baby doesn't know how to contact their parents. You have to think what kind of situation they had to leave in order for that to be the better outcome.
I think, Lydia, did you have a question?
I haven't finished the book. I feel like I'm reading poetry when I read your book, so it's just so beautiful. I'm wondering, when you wrote this book, was it helpful to you? Did it feel like a little bit of a release, or was it difficult? I mean, it's such a personal book.
It was not a release at all. Pardon my language, but it sucked. It sucked writing it. It was terrible. I was miserable for 2 years.
What made you go on?
That I had signed a contract, and Harper has very scary lawyers.
Oh, okay.
And I didn't want to give the money back.
Yeah.
In fact, I probably couldn't have. I had already spent it by then, the advance that I got, which wasn't a lot, but it was something. Yeah, that's. I'm trying to get into the habit of shortening my answers because I tend to just go into rabbit holes and rabbit holes.
Yeah.
So it's not that I'm being curt, it's that I'm opening up the floor for more questions, but that's the short answer, is that it was not fun. And I probably will never do this again. So I hope I have another book in me.
Yeah.
Maybe a different kind of book, maybe a novel, maybe another book of poems, but not a memoir, at least not without therapy.
I'd like to follow up on Lydia's question with a question about the difference as a writer between this is your first work of prose, but you are best known as a poet. And I'm going to join that with a quote of yours that I immediately wrote down, which was, "You were either in one country or another. There was no in between, black and white. I had no patience for gray." Well, it seemed to me that was such an unusual thing for a poet to say, because aren't nuances and shades of gray, isn't that at the heart of poetry? And does that speak somewhat to the difference between this work and your previous work?
Yeah, I mean, you're so close to the subject matter in prose, especially in nonfiction, that it's difficult to separate yourself from the artistic aesthetics that you establish in poetry. And in poetry, I guess for some, not for all, but it was the case for me, being more of a lyric poet instead of being a narrative poet, who didn't necessarily draw from the specific examples of my life for my poems, but drew tangentially from those experiences and recreated the emotional resonances of those experiences versus the thematic and descriptive instances of my life. And so I was able to distance myself through the abstract in poems. And it is through the abstract in poems that I was able to really live in that grayness. But because my poems did not exist in my life and my life did not exist in my poems, it was compartmentalized. My life was one thing, my poems were another, because I couldn't speak about my life in my poems. To speak about my life in my poems was to put myself in danger. And so that in itself spoke to my life, not my poems. And in my life, everything needed to be black and white. I had no luxury of nuance. I needed to drive at exactly 25 miles an hour because I could not be pulled over. The thresholds for mistakes and their consequences were so small that everything in my life felt like it needed to be direct, that I could not live in mystery, that I couldn't, with so much uncertainty in my life already and helplessness, why would I want to recreate that? It was such a fun, and this was like my first, I was a sophomore in college, and I probably would have pursued photography if it hadn't been for an English class that I had where we read poetry. But it was just another medium of kind of figuring out what I was trying to say, what I was trying to do. And the art department took me and a few other like quote unquote gifted students to a tour of all of the museums in LA. And like, it was probably through art that I came to poetry.
Okay. Who else has a question for Marcelo? Well, I have a sheet full, so I can carry on, but I don't want to hog the floor here. So please, someone speak up. All right. Let me ask you about, you mentioned architectural spaces and the emotion of the people who inhabit them. Could you talk some more about that in the context of the various landscapes of your life?
Yeah, I mean, the only metaphor that I really felt true was actually living in the spaces that I talk about, and living in the very ordinary ranch house style American home in which the desire to have an open concept layout felt like not a critique, but it felt like a commentary on the way that Americans live their lives, in which you wear your heart on your sleeve, in which on the facade, on the outside, it feels like you are more candid with others. And having those kinds of architectural aesthetics, like the very popular open layout, felt like everything was out on the table. And when I returned, I knew this was the case in Mexico, but when I returned to Mexico, everything is compartmentalized. If you were in the kitchen was one room, and you had to exit into the patio outside and then enter the living room. And if you were in the living room, you had to exit back outside and into the patio and go to the bathroom, which was separated across the courtyard. And that kind of separation felt like a, what is it called when you eat like a little bit of sorbet in between like fancy meals? A palate cleanser?
Palate cleansing, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
If you had a fight in the kitchen, the act of having to go into the living room, the act of stepping outside felt like it impacted some kind of, it had an emotional impact. Simply because you are in a different space. And so I talk about that. I talk about, the trajectory of American households from the different styles, like the Tudor style, the cottage style, and all that, and really comparing it to the modernism that I saw in poor communities in Mexico, and the kind of modernism that came from Europe that was lend itself easily to poor campesinos in Mexico because it was a square on top of another square next to another square. You don't see peaked roofs in Mexico. Yeah. That's so much wasted space. There's no reason to waste that space. And so I guess it's just, speaking figuratively and speaking about my observations of the kind of spaces that I inhabited.
Okay. Do we have time for a last question? I have one more question, or perhaps someone else does.
I see a hand.
Oh, great.
I think that's my hand. Hi. My name is Hadassah. I am from Trinidad and Tobago. I just was thinking about what you said, Marcelo, about how the process of writing such a deeply personal memoir, how it took so much out of you. And as a Black woman, I'm thinking about, that discourse on, being expected to kind of lean into our traumas and to bring that out to the page. And I wondered I know you touched on it a bit, but do you think that, is it worth the cost, the personal cost, the personal toll of, bringing such difficult subject matters, such personal subject matters to light for other readers, maybe to glean from it? Do you think it's really worth it in the end?
Absolutely not, because our lives are too complicated to be stifled into only our pain. We are more than our pain. We are our joy. We are our laughter. We are our small rituals. We are our past. We are our stories. And the pain is just one small part of that. And so if you encompass your story only about the pain, then are we telling other people that we only exist in pain? That our registers of emotion and our range of emotion are tilted so much to one side that we are incapable of joy, that we are incapable of love? I didn't want that. Yes, it was difficult because the subject matter was difficult, but at every turn, I didn't want to speak about the spectacular. I wanted to address the hidden, sometimes unseen types of violences that we don't normally think about. And in the chapter of the U visa specifically, I talk about how the police in order for you to get a U visa, which is a visa that protects victims of crime, people who have been victims of violent crime, which my mother was, in order to receive the U visa, you have to fit the definition of what the police think is violence. And if your kind of violence that you experience does not fit their narrow definition, then they do not certify your application, and it cannot go to a judge. It cannot proceed. And so that really hammered the point for me that there is a kind of suffering that goes unnoticed, that goes untalked about. And yes, it is difficult to write about that, but it was less difficult than thinking that I had to be self-gratuitous and sell my traumas, which wasn't the case. So I would say no, absolutely not. There's too much beauty in our lives to think that our traumas are the only thing that are valued by the external literary industrial complex.
Thank you. I appreciated that. Thank you so much.
Thanks for that question.
Marcelo, I'm being mindful of the time because I'd like you to stay for a whole nother hour, but it is 8 o'clock and I want to honor that. Thank you so much for coming. Your book is powerful. It's poetic. I think just this taste of talking to you has been wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's been a true honor. Thank you for your presence and all of your questions and the conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming. If you do want we did get some free copies of your book. And I think there's still some at the St. Anthony Park Library if you would like to get your own copy.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Okay. Bye.
Marcelo, I just wanted to say that I really, really loved the way you structured the book and the way you built in the little tidbits, the movement sections, particularly
Vignettes.
the vignettes that sort of are flashbacks, and that felt like maybe your poetry or maybe music, like a symphony. And it was really beautiful, and especially what stuck with me was the story of your father breaking a horse and spinning in one place just to stay there, and it feels like that is a piece of your story, and just really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Have a good evening.